When I forgot my keys, I expected frustration, but instead, my landlady opened the door with a smile that felt like an invitation I wasn't supposed to want. I never thought forgetting my keys would turn into the start of something I couldn't stop thinking about. It was late, the sky dark and still after a long day, the street quiet except for the hum of a street lamp. I stood outside the old wooden porch of the house I rented, patting my pockets with a sinking feeling. The jingling sound I hoped for wasn't there. My keys were inside. I sighed, staring at the door, and for a moment, I debated sleeping in my car. But then, almost against my better judgment, I lifted my hand and knocked. A few seconds passed, then the sound of footsteps, steady and unhurried. The door creaked open, and there she was, my landlady. She looked like she had just settled in for the night, soft gray sweater draped over her shoulders, her hair loosely tied back, strands falling across her face in a way that seemed effortlessly graceful. Her eyes, a shade too sharp to miss anything, fell on me with a mix of curiosity and mild annoyance. "You forgot the keys," she said, her voice calm but edged with a teasing disbelief. And before I could stop myself, the words slipped out, "because I knew you'd let me in." It was half a joke, half the truth, but the moment I said it, the air seemed to shift. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into the faintest smile, the kind that reveals both amusement and hesitation. The porch light above us flickered, throwing shadows across her face, softening the lines of her expression. I caught the faint scent of her perfume carried on the cool night air, warm, subtle, grounding. And suddenly, I wasn't just standing outside my own home. I was standing on the edge of something else. She held the doorknob with one hand, and for a heartbeat too long, she didn't move, as though deciding whether to let me cross that threshold. Her gaze lingered on me, not obvious, not blatant, but enough to make me shift on my feet, aware of every second that passed. Finally, she sighed softly, shaking her head with a small, knowing smile. "Come in," she murmured, stepping aside. And just like that, I was inside. But it wasn't the house I felt I'd entered. It was her world, warm, lit gently, and carrying the quiet gravity of someone who didn't open doors for just anyone. That night, a simple mistake with keys turned into the first moment I realized, maybe some doors are worth forgetting on purpose. Inside, the house felt different than it usually did. Maybe it was because I'd entered through her, not just through the door. The light from a single lamp painted the living room in soft gold, shadows resting in the corners. Everything about the space felt lived in yet carefully arranged, books stacked neatly on the coffee table, a half-folded blanket draped over the couch, a faint trace of lavender in the air. She closed the door quietly behind me and turned, her expression settling into something calmer. "You should be more careful," she said, her tone carrying that gentle scolding only someone older could make sound so natural. I smiled sheepishly, rubbing the back of my neck. "I'll try," I replied, though a part of me wondered if I really wanted to. Without asking, she moved toward the kitchen. "Tea," she offered, her voice trailing back toward me. I followed slowly, watching the easy rhythm of her steps, the way her sweater slid slightly off one shoulder as she reached for the cupboard. There was nothing intentional in her movements, yet each one carried a quiet elegance I couldn't ignore. I sat at the small wooden table, listening to the familiar sounds, the rustle of tea bags, the hiss of boiling water. She placed 2 cups on the counter, and when she brought mine over, her hand brushed against mine as she set it down. A fleeting touch. Barely a second. But my chest tightened as though that single moment carried more weight than it should. She didn't notice, or maybe she pretended not to. She sat across from me, cupping her tea in both hands, her eyes soft but guarded. I tried not to stare, but I noticed things I hadn't before, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she grew thoughtful, the way her lips pressed lightly against the rim of her cup before she set it down again. We spoke in simple exchanges, about the rain earlier, about how the neighborhood had gone quiet since summer ended. But beneath the small talk, there was a current I couldn't name. Something in the pauses between her words, in the way her eyes met mine and lingered just a little too long before sliding away. The tea was warm, steadying, but it wasn't what comforted me most. It was her presence, calm, unhurried, yet carrying a hidden depth. I realized then, it wasn't the drink I needed. It was the small gestures, the silent threads between us, weaving something heavier than either of us dared to admit. The rain had started again, light at first, then steady, tapping against the window like a quiet rhythm meant only for the two of us. The sound filled the pauses in our conversation, and strangely, it didn't feel empty. It felt comforting. We sat across from each other at the small table, tea cups between us, the steam curling upward and fading into the dim glow of the lamp. I leaned back slightly, fingers tapping idly on the wooden surface, pretending I wasn't searching for the right words to keep her talking. She spoke first. "I've gotten used to nights like this," she said softly, her eyes shifting toward the rain. "Quiet, predictable. It's easier that way." I tilted my head, curious. Easier, or safer? Her gaze flicked back to me, startled for a moment, then softened. "Both," she admitted. She gave a small, almost self-conscious laugh, and I noticed the way she traced the rim of her cup with her fingertip, as though the motion steadied her thoughts. I told her about myself, about how I wasn't sure what I was doing with my life. About how it felt like I was standing at the edge of something but never sure which way to move. My words felt clumsy at first, but she listened so intently, her expression free of judgment, that the honesty slipped out more easily than I expected. "It doesn't go away, you know," she said gently after a pause. "That uncertainty. You just get better at carrying it." Her words lingered, heavier than I wanted to admit. I watched her as she spoke, the way her hands moved slightly when she was making a point, the way her voice dipped low and steady, like she was confiding something she didn't share often. Silence followed, but it wasn't awkward. It was thick with understanding. I found myself memorizing the shape of that moment, the rain outside, the glow of the lamp, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of both laughter and loss. I wanted to say more, to tell her that her presence made the uncertainty feel less frightening, but the words lodged somewhere deep in my chest. Instead, I simply held her gaze, and she didn't look away. That silence stretched longer than it should have, pulling us into something unspoken. Something we both felt but couldn't name. It was just a conversation, but it didn't feel ordinary. It felt like the beginning of a bond neither of us had expected, yet both of us seemed unwilling to break. Later that night, after the tea had gone cold and the rain finally eased, she noticed the small lock on my door rattling loosely in its frame. "That's probably why it sticks sometimes," she said, her tone practical, though her eyes softened when they met mine. "Come on, I'll show you." We knelt side by side in the narrow hallway, the quiet broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards under our knees. She held a small screwdriver in one hand, her sweater sleeve slipping up as she steadied the lock. I leaned closer, trying to follow her instructions, though truthfully, I was more aware of her presence than the task itself. Her shoulder brushed mine as she adjusted the angle of the tool. The contact was light, accidental, but it sent a ripple through me all the same. I tried to focus, but the closeness made everything blur. "You're holding it wrong," she teased softly, a hint of amusement coloring her words. She reached for my hand, guiding it gently into place. Her fingers wrapped around mine, steadying my grip. The touch was practical, innocent in its intent, yet it lingered. Her skin was warm against mine, her hand firm but delicate. I could feel the faint brush of her breath near my temple as she leaned in, her hair slipping forward, brushing my cheek for the briefest moment. My chest tightened, my focus narrowing to that single point where our hands connected. We both laughed when the screws slipped again, the sound echoing lightly in the quiet hall. But even through the laughter, neither of us pulled away immediately. It was as if the simple excuse of the lock had given us permission to exist closer than we usually dared. When she finally withdrew, setting the screwdriver aside, her expression carried something unreadable, a mixture of amusement and restraint. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes flickering to mine for just a second longer than necessary. "There," she said softly, as though declaring the lock fixed, though we both knew she was speaking about something else entirely. I nodded, pretending to examine the door, but inside I was caught in the echo of her touch, the warmth still lingering against my skin, the memory of her laughter blending with the closeness of her breath. It was nothing more than a small, practical gesture. Yet to me, it felt like the kind of moment people don't plan, don't talk about, but never forget. The storm arrived suddenly, as if the night itself had decided to test us. One moment the house was still, the next it shuddered under the weight of thunder. The lights flickered, buzzing once, twice, before finally giving out. Darkness filled the rooms, broken only by the flash of lightning outside. I heard her sigh softly, then the faint strike of a match. A single candle came to life, its glow trembling between us. She set it on the low table, and the shadows danced across her face, softening the edges, drawing my eyes to her in ways I didn't want to admit. We sat on the sofa, side by side, but not too close. The space between us felt intentional, careful. Yet every time the candle flickered, it seemed to shrink the distance, pulling us together in silence. She leaned back, her arms crossed lightly over her chest, her gaze fixed on the small flame. I could see the thoughts in her eyes, caution, hesitation, maybe even fear. I wanted to break the silence, to say something simple, something safe. But the words stayed locked inside me. Instead, I watched the way the light touched her, how it caught in her hair, how it softened her expression into something almost vulnerable. I felt an ache in my chest, a longing I couldn't disguise even from myself. I thought about reaching for her hand, about closing that last inch of distance. But my fingers stayed curled tightly against my knee. What if it was wrong? What if I broke something fragile that was only just beginning to exist between us? She shifted slightly, and for a moment, I thought she would move closer. But instead, she exhaled slowly, her lips pressing into a faint, unreadable smile. Her eyes met mine, and the silence between us grew heavy, no longer comfortable but charged, like the air before a storm's lightning strike. The thunder rumbled outside, low and distant, and I realized my heartbeat had taken on the same rhythm, steady, insistent, impossible to ignore. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. The candle flame bent under the draft from the window, but it didn't go out. Just like whatever held us in that moment, fragile, flickering, but still alive. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't even a touch. It was a silence so thick, so full of everything we didn't dare say, that it left me more shaken than any storm ever could. The storm eventually gave way to silence. The thunder drifted further into the distance, leaving only the faint dripping of rain outside the window. Yet inside, neither of us had moved. The candle had burned low, its light soft and golden, wrapping the room in a kind of fragile warmth. It was almost morning. I could tell by the pale hint of dawn seeping faintly through the curtains. The world was stirring back to life, but for us, time felt suspended, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees, her eyes fixed on the candle flame. Her voice was quiet, almost as though she was speaking to herself. "You shouldn't look at me like that." The words landed between us, gentle but heavy. I didn't pretend not to understand. I knew what she meant. I knew she had felt it too, the weight of my gaze, the things I hadn't said but hadn't hidden either. I swallowed, my throat dry, and for the first time that night, I let the truth slip past my hesitation. Maybe I can't help it. Her head turned then, slowly, her eyes meeting mine. And in them, I saw not just her strength, but her fear. Not fear of me, but of what this connection might mean. Of what it might cost her, cost us both. The silence stretched again, but it was different now. Not empty. Not uncertain. It was the kind of silence that only comes when words would be too small for the truth. Her hand moved before I even realized it. Resting gently on mine, not accidental, not casual. A choice. The warmth of her palm seeped into my skin, steady, grounding, yet trembling faintly, as though she too was crossing a line she had promised herself not to. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The simple weight of her touch carried more than any embrace could. It was trust, it was longing, it was the quiet confession neither of us could yet speak aloud. She held it there for a few seconds, seconds that felt like an eternity, before she withdrew, fingers sliding away slowly, leaving behind the echo of her warmth. Her eyes dropped, her lips parting as if to say something more, but no words followed. The first streaks of dawn broke through the curtains then, soft and golden, touching her face like a secret. And I realized, sometimes a confession doesn't need to be spoken. Sometimes it's in the way a hand lingers, and the way two people breathe in the same fragile silence. By the time the world outside fully woke, the house was quiet again, carrying that hushed calm that follows a storm. The candle had burned itself down, leaving only a faint trail of smoke curling upward. Morning light seeped through the curtains, brighter now, softening everything it touched. She rose from the sofa first, moving with the unhurried grace I had come to recognize. I stayed seated, watching as she crossed the room, her step steady, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I wondered if she regretted the hand she had left on mine. If the silence that had felt so heavy and intimate for me meant something different for her. But when she returned, she held my keys in her hand. She placed them gently in my palm, her fingers brushing against mine, lingering there in a way that told me it wasn't just about the keys. Next time, she said softly, almost teasing, "Don't forget these." I nodded, but neither of us pulled our hands away immediately. The keys pressed into my skin, cool and solid, but what I felt most was the warmth of her touch, deliberate, calm, and impossibly steady. When our eyes met, there was no need for explanation. The look she gave me wasn't one of regret. It wasn't dismissal, either. It was quiet acknowledgement, an unspoken promise that whatever had begun between us didn't need to be rushed. I smiled, a small, almost hesitant curve of my lips, but it was enough to make her eyes soften, her guarded expression easing just a little. She withdrew her hand at last, but not without letting her fingers slip away slowly, as if reluctant to break that connection. We stood there in the hallway, sunlight spilling between us, the world outside already alive with distant voices and car engines. But here, in this narrow space between doors, time stretched again, tender, suspended. I didn't need to say more. Neither did she. Sometimes beginnings aren't marked by grand gestures or declarations. Sometimes they're found in the simplest of moments, a forgotten key, a smile shared in the half-light, the quiet courage of two people choosing not to close the door too quickly. As I stepped back into my own space, the key still warm in my hand, I realized something. Forgetting it had been a mistake, but one I might never want to correct. Because maybe, just maybe, some doors are meant to stay open.